Hey y'all, and welcome to the next one. We're going to take a look at the economy. The economy is an extremely important social institution in sociology and the social sciences. It has a big impact on our lives, on our daily lives, and the decisions we make. Let me just start here with a little definition of the economy. The economy is simply our system of producing and distributing goods and services. It's the method in which we make sure that products are distributed to people in various ways. All societies have some form of economy because even tribal societies have to have a way of distributing food at the very least, producing and distributing food. Of course, our economy now in the United States and countries like the United States are very complex, and the products in which we see are, of course, very complex. We're going to take a look at the economy, specifically at a few issues here related to how the economy in the world has changed over time. You can see here kind of a complicated little visual representation of what's happened over time as far as the economy. So these eras that I've talked about in the past, eras like the pre-industrial society, industrial, and the post-industrial society, all have sort of certain things going on with them. So I'm going to talk about those in relationship to the economy. In the pre-industrial society, this was a society that went from hunting and gathering. Remember, it transitions to a pastoral society. That's that society where people are domesticating animals so they don't have to move around as much. And eventually, it transitions into an agricultural society. So, this is all in the pre industrial era. And I want to point out how closely technology is connected to these types of things. For example, the key invention really of the pre industrial society, the invention that allowed societies to get bigger and more complex, was really something we view as very simple nowadays, but it was the plow, this plow that's being pulled by an animal. So this comes from an ancient Egypt hieroglyphic. And once you had the plow, farmers could farm a lot more land than before. That freed up other people to do other things. So not everyone had to farm in an agricultural society. Most people did. But you could get these upper classes and wealthier classes, and people could spend more time learning how to read and write and those types of things. And thus we see the birth of what we think of as civilization. Well, this era goes on, this pre industrial era goes on all the way up really to the late 1700s and the early 1800s. The Europeans who came to the United States, the Pilgrims and the Puritans would have been examples of people who were still in this pre industrial era. Now, what ends up happening is we transition into another era, the era that we call the industrial era. So, industrialization occurs. And what's really key about this industrial era is that the economy entirely changes. So we see this big change in the economy from primarily everyone being farmers to more and more people working in factories as we get the invention of power, specifically water power first, and then most importantly, steam power. So it's a change in the economy, this industrialization that leads to urbanization. It leads to these large cities, and it leads to big changes in the type of work people are doing. Let me zoom out here so I can show you um, uh, a graph here that shows you changes in work just since the 1900s. And so this doesn't go back all the way to early American history, but you can already see the trends that I'm talking about. By 1900, 30% of people were farmers in the United States. And this number would have been significantly more if we followed it back to the pre-industrial era in the 1700s or 1600s. But this decline has been occurring because of technology, because we see technologies that allow people to farm much, much more than they did in the past. So one farmer can now farm hundreds of acres, where maybe in the past, with the hand plows and such, you would have been limited to maybe 20 or 30 acres. At the same time, this is the era we're talking about right now, that industrial era, the era where factory work took over. And we call that blue collar, by the way. Blue collar work is factory work, production work. And you can see that at its height in the late 1930s, 1940s, about half of the population was in the blue collar. But that starts changing too. You can see that white collar work, which used to be a small percentage of the population, is now at around 80% of the population or so, 70 to 80%. White collar work is what we call service work. And what makes that possible is a transition from the industrial era into the post-industrial era. This transition occurs in the 1950s, 1960s, and what really happens is that during this time, computer technology is invented. So once we have computers, society really starts to change in drastic ways. Now, in the post-industrial era, meaning after factories, information is of key importance. So you see, we now have this information explosion. And just think about how much information you have access to today that you wouldn't have 50 or 60 years ago, especially because of the internet. Um, Increasingly, we see this huge service sector. So most of you, if not all of you, taking this class are training to be in the service sector, teaching, nursing, any of the healthcare fields, engineering. These are all service sector jobs, and what it means is you're selling information. Globalization has been another trend, this increasing connection throughout the world, once again made possible by technology and, of course, extensive trade amongst nations. So now it's not unusual to have a single product like a phone, a smartphone, that has pieces made all over the world. So um, a very important aspect of how the economy has changed. Now, let me mention here that as we go from this pre-industrial society and move across into industrialization and then eventually into the post-industrial society, one thing that happens is we have increasing inequality, meaning the gap between those who have little and the gap between those who have a lot gets larger and larger. So as wealth builds up, it builds up so that now you can see people in the United States, for example, where the average salary, family salary, is somewhere around 45, 50,000 a year. But you can also find someone now who's a billionaire. So that's what I mean by increasing inequality, the difference between the upper class and the lower class. Okay, the last thing I want to really mention here in relationship to the economy is the two types of economic systems that exist. And so I'm going to put this up here, and if you're familiar with this, this is what we call a Venn diagram. And so it shows capitalism on one side and socialism on the other side, and then it shows this area there's an overlap, so some similarities that are occurring. So on the capitalism side, this is the model, the economic model we have in the United States. And this is really developed from the ideas of a guy named Adam Smith. And he said that the three sort of components of capitalism are competition. So in a capitalist society, we believe that competition's good. And so even think about at school, K through 12 education, where we train people to compete. We have competitive sports, we give awards to best students, we have valedictorian and salutatorian and things like that. We're really encouraging people to be capitalists. In some ways, we train them without them even knowing it. Um, a next sort of point of capitalism is it's based upon private ownership. And what that means is individuals can buy and sell property and businesses and products, but you have private ownership of these things. And of course, the third feature of capitalism is the idea that profit is your goal. No one starts a business with the idea of breaking even or losing money. The idea is that eventually you'll have excess money, you'll have more money than you're spending. So that's the ideas behind capitalism. Now, true sort of unfettered capitalism would be what we call laissez-faire capitalism. And laissez-faire capitalism means there's really no regulation. If you have an idea for a product, you go out and sell it. And if people like it and if it's a good product, they'll buy it. Um, we don't really have that in the United States. We have what you call welfare state capitalism. Welfare state capitalism is where you see that regulation. So the government regulates some aspects of capitalism. And just think one of the classic examples in the United States is the Food and Drug Administration. Right? If you make a product and you say that it cures cancer, you're going to have to prove that it does so before you're allowed to sell it. You can't just go out there and sell it. And that regulation is there to protect consumers. And so we see that in the welfare state capitalism. Now, in other parts of the world, we see another system, and this develops from the ideas of one of the sociologists, Karl Marx, this idea of socialism. And the three sort of key features of socialism is instead of private property, public ownership. And what that means is that sort of everyone owns everything. Or to put it more simply, the people as a group own the means of production, factories, and those sort of things. In practice, when governments have tried to do socialism, the old Soviet Union was an example, Cuba is an example, China is somewhat of an example. It meant that the government ended up owning businesses and such. Well, since you don't have competition, how do you decide how many products to make? How would the Soviet Union decide how many cars to make? Well, they did it through central planning, which meant the government would decide how many products to make in a given year. In the United States, or in a capitalist system, of course, it's supply and demand. So think of the iPhone. How many iPhones does Apple make each year? However many there's demand for. Right? If people want to buy it, they're going to make them. And then the last one, and this comes from sort of Marxist thinking about social classes, is the idea that profit is immoral. So Marx said that profit goes to the rich, it goes to the wealthy, it goes to the business owners. And he said if there was any profit, it should go to the people who actually make the product. So it should go to the workers. So they viewed profit as immoral. I do want to mention here that although these sound extremely different, and they are, what's happened over time is that we see that these are coming together. It's called convergence theory. That economies are coming together, putting together parts of capitalism that work and parts of socialism that work. And they're creating what we call hybrid or mixed economies. Those are economies where there's some things run capitalistic and some things run socialistic. I mean, think about the United States for an example. Our businesses in the United States tend to run on the capitalism model. It makes sense. Seems to work pretty well as far as for a growing economy. However, there are elements of our society that run on the socialist model. A great one, which you're taking part in right now, is education. In general, education is more on the socialist side of things. Um, we don't do a lot of private, for profit education. We kind of think that that's a bad idea. Everyone should have access to education, and education should serve the public good. So we're not for profit. Like Stark State is a non for profit. We're run by the government. Any money, any excess money that we make, so to speak, gets put right back into the college. So we've seen this sort of hybrid or mixed economy develop where people borrow things from capitalism and socialism in a way that they work. Interestingly, sort of last note here for those of you going into healthcare, I know we always have a lot of people doing that. Um, in many countries, um, they use a socialist model for healthcare, and the idea here is that having healthcare where you have a lot of money changing hand and where there's profit is really not good. It should be available to everyone. It should be essentially supported by tax dollars. It's not free, of course, but supported by tax dollars so that everyone gets it, as opposed to insurance. In the United States, healthcare, of course, is more on the capitalist model where people compete, and when there's a profit motive, oftentimes. So, an interesting sort of view of how these two systems sort of differ. Okay, so that was the economy. As always, of course, be sure you get in that book. There's a lot of information that I haven't covered, but I just wanted to give you a start so you could kind of feel what's going on here. So, you all have a great week. This is really getting close to wrapping it up, so be sure you get everything done, and I'll see you on the next one.